Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. I usually rate my books straight after I finish reading them. However, I often like to look back at things I read early in the year or in the previous year and see if I still feel the same way or if I want to bump up or down some of my ratings. And especially, I tend to be really stingy with my 5-star ratings, especially when I first read a book. I just want to check if a few months later that book has actually still stuck with me, or if perhaps I forgot about it, even though at the time it might have seemed one of my new favorites. So, like I did earlier this year with my 2020 books, today I want to look back at all the books I read in the first half of 2021. So, let's get started. So, I'm going to start from fiction books. The first one I have is one of my early reads from 2021, actually before I even started the channel. And it's Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. A very, very popular book, very famous book, doesn't need a lot of introduction really. And for me, it goes into solid tier. So solid tier for me is sort of 4-star, I would say. So something I quite enjoyed, something I quite liked for different reasons. However, not necessarily something that really stood out of the pack or a new favorite. I think my feelings are still very similar to how I felt when I first read it. And if anything, I have to say a lot of the details of the book, obviously it's been several months, but I'm slightly finding it a bit forgettable. So it's going to stay there as going no higher, I'm afraid. Moving on, I have Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I'm purposely not putting into the sci-fi bucket because I really feel calling it sci-fi sort of misrepresents the vibes of the book. I think regardless of whether you like or not the book, it really doesn't feel like a sci-fi book. It's more like a straight literary fiction book. Some of you might expect me to put it into Time I Won't Get Back, which for me is probably like a 2-star or below. But I'm actually going to put it into the meh bucket because it's not really a book I hated or anything. I think I rated it 5 out of 10, so 2.5 stars. I probably still stand by that rating. I found it incredibly underwhelming. I don't think it's a bad book, so I'm still sort of glad that I read it. I would not put it into my lowest bucket, but at the same time I was quite disappointed also because Ishiguro is a writer that I really expect a lot from, and I didn't really get that from Clara and the Sun, so that is it. Moving on, Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi goes into donuts. Donuts tier for me is, I would say, 4.5 stars. So something that really stands out, but not necessarily one of my all-time favorites, which would go into my highest bucket, which is The Dog's Bollocks. But Donuts tier is still very, very good. And this is one of those that I think initially I rated lower and then I bumped up because it's definitely one that is incredibly memorable. Unlike, say, Little Fires Everywhere, where a lot of the details for me are a bit fuzzy right now, Burnt Sugar, I pretty much remember most of what happens in the book in a fair amount of detail. So that tells you the sort of impact that this type of book can give you. If you haven't heard of this before, it's a straight literary fiction book, I would say, all set in modern day India, where it sort of revolves around the relationship between a mother and a daughter, where the daughter is called to look after the mother, who's showing signs of dementia. But the daughter is really resentful towards her mum because her mum wasn't really the role model of a mother that you normally expect. So there's a lot of that sort of dynamics going on, and it's really dark book. So really dark, but also very impactful, I would say. And from one of my darkest books, let's move on to one of my lightest books, which is Red, White, and Royal Blue. I'm going to put this into solid tier. I think I rated this 4 stars. I still feel the same way. It kind of knows what it is. It's not a particularly memorable book, but it does what it says on the tin, and it does it reasonably well. So definitely not going to get any hate from me. But at the same time, it's not going to go any higher either. So it's going to be a solid read if you're into that sort of story. Again, even just looking at the cover, you can sort of tell what it's about. But it's about this gay romance between the first son of the United States and Prince Henry, I think it was called, of England. So the grandnephew of the Queen of England, something like that. Very cheesy, very corny, but as I said, it doesn't take itself too seriously and it does what it says on the tin. So, okay, moving on, I have Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. And I think I rated this 3 stars when I first read it, but I'm afraid this is actually going to go into my lowest bucket, time I won't get back. For most books, I usually think, oh, I'm still glad I read it. For this one, it's one of those that actually I'm kind of thinking I just wish I hadn't bothered with. This is semi-autobiographical, so it's really fiction, but from what I gather, it's also heavily inspired by her own life, and so it depicts how she grew up in a relatively narrow-minded environment. But there's a lot of sort of fantasy-like elements and mythological retellings weaved in, sort of thing that just felt so amateurish to me. So honestly, a few months later, it's a complete thumbs down for me for this one. Let's move on to Memorial, Brian Washington. This is the story of 2 gay men in the States. I think a Japanese American guy and an African American guy, if I'm not mistaken. And it all revolves around their relationship when the Japanese mom of one of them comes and visit, and the Japanese guy actually goes back to Japan to see his dad and help out his dad. And so around the dynamics between their relationship, the love relationship between the 2 guys, but also how that blends with the family dynamics of the 2 families. It's one that I liked. I didn't love, but I think I rated 4 stars, and it would still go into the solid bucket for me. So not one that has become a new favorite or anything, but definitely one that I enjoyed and did a lot of things right. So it definitely deserves its middle tier 4-star position. And then I have The Count of Monte Cristo, which I read in May, and it took me a good month, possibly even longer, with a small group of people. We went through this, and I rated this, I think, 3.5 stars, so about 7 out of 10, and it still goes into solid for me. It slightly felt like a glorified soap opera, but on the other hand, it's massively influential and a pretty good revenge story. Again, it doesn't need a lot of introduction here, but it's one of those that I know a lot of people would put into the top tier, and it's one of the favorite books of all time. I read the unabridged version, and I thought there was so much filler, so much fluff that didn't need to be there. So it's one that I enjoyed to a large extent, that I really respect, but definitely doesn't go any higher than that for me. 3.5 star it was, and still in solid tier. Now, moving on to historical fiction, I have Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And this initially I rated 4.5 stars, which would go into Donuts tier, and it still goes there. I would be slightly tempted to put it even higher now, but I still remember how much it annoyed me in terms of her writing style. There's still something about her writing style that doesn't fully connect with me. However, it's still one that I really, really enjoyed and really stands out from my first half of the year reading. If you have not heard about this, probably unlikely, but if you haven't, this is the Thomas Cromwell history. So that Henry VIII period of history, of English history, but all told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell himself, who was the private secretary of very humble origins of the monarch, and really involved in all the political intrigue of the time. And it's a really amazing book. If you, particularly if you end up enjoying Hilary Mantel's writing style, this is definitely amazing if you love historical fiction. And well, it's donuts here. What else do I need to say? Still, for historical fiction, I have Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers, and this I rated 9 out of 10 early in the year, and it's still I still stand by that rating. It's still in donuts tier for me. So one of my favorite books of the year for sure. This is probably one of the less known books from all of these, I would say. And this is about the story of this woman who's single and lives in suburban England, near London. This is all set in the 50s, and she lives with her elderly mother, and she's called to investigate this story of another woman who claims to have given birth by parthenogenesis, so without any sexual intercourse. And it's a very gentle story, very somber, sort of vibes, very understated, but very beautiful. And I really, really liked it. And it sort of really surprised me in a way because I didn't really have high expectations or any expectations for that matter about this book. So, still one of my favorites. And in Donuts tier, it doesn't go any higher because I don't know. At the same time, it doesn't feel like a new all-time favorite, even though I really, really enjoyed it. There was slightly something missing to make that really got tier, so still really good, but still not the dog's bollocks. Okay, moving on to thrillers. I have Hostage by Claire McIntosh, which is a new release for this year. And I rated this 4 stars at the time, and I stand by their rating, still goes into solid tier. This is about, as you can kind of tell from the cover, it's about this woman who works as cabin crew, and she's called to make this really awful choice between the life of her own child, who's with the dad in London, and the life of the passengers of the flight she's on board. So it's a really good thriller, really well written. If you've read anything by Claire McIntosh before, it's in a similar style, fast paced, and with a few twists and turns, and a really good book. But again, nothing to write home about, so it doesn't make it any higher than that for me. And still another thriller mystery book is Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. It doesn't really need a lot of introduction. I rated this 4 stars at the time, and it still goes into solid tier for me. Really good, really enjoyable read. If you're into that murder mystery style of books, with the added benefit in this case of being in that train setting on a long haul journey, very different vibes from long haul traveling today, and being really immersed in that era. It was really good. The characters are always quite memorable in that way that Christie can depict. So really solid read for me, and I would still recommend that book. And then I have Behind Her Eyes. I rated this 4 stars at the time, and I think I'm bumping this up to Donuts tier, so probably 4.5 stars now, because I found that so unique. This might not be everybody's cup of tea, because especially the final twist is very WTF. It's got a bit of a paranormal element to it, which again, if you're not really into that sort of thing in your thrillers, might perhaps annoy you. But I think I knew there was that paranormal element, so I was sort of expecting it. But also, I don't mind it at all. And I thought it was just so unique and so memorable. I tend to forget thrillers pretty quickly. This one is definitely one that I still remember in quite a lot of detail. It really stood out. So it's Donuts tier for me. It was really, really good. And then another thriller, which is Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. And I rated this, I think, 4 stars when I read it, but I'm actually going to bump this down to meh tier. I have to say, I read this because I really, really loved the Da Vinci Code when I read it 15 plus years ago, maybe more than 15 years ago now. And I was kind of in the mood for something like that. But I don't know, it didn't feel as memorable as Da Vinci Code. And at the same time, it was still that sort of formulaic approach to thrillers. I wasn't too impressed. So even though it was kind of enjoyable, I was expecting a bit more. And especially now looking back, it's definitely not one that feels particularly memorable. So meh tier it is, I'm afraid. And now moving on to sci-fi. I have The Three Body Problem by Shizun Liu. I have a full review for this in the channel for the whole trilogy, which is one of the big trilogies I guess I've read this year. I'm going to put this into solid tier. it didn't feel as strong as the rest of the series, but it's definitely very original and very science heavy. So I will only recommend this sort of book for someone who's really into that sort of hard sci-fi where science takes really the center stage, and it's not just a character-driven book with some aliens in the background or something like that, or even a plot-driven book where you just have a spaceship. This is like a science-driven book with a lot of really deep scientific concepts. And the first book, in my opinion, was the weakest, at least in my opinion, between the three. So the first goes into solid tier, but actually book number 2 and book number 3 go into donuts tier. That were all pretty amazing, pretty mind-blowing in terms of the scientific concepts that they explored. Not so much when it comes to plot and characters. It's still interesting, but the science really is what stands out. And from that perspective, this is an amazing trilogy that I would really, really recommend. Still doesn't make it to the dog's bollocks because it would have had to have strong characters and strong plot for me to make it to dog's bollocks. But still, really, really good, especially books 2 and 3 for me really stood out. And then I have The Employee by Olga Raven. And I picked this up because it was longlisted for the International Booker Prize earlier this year. And I rated this 6 out of 10, so 3 stars. So it would have gone into meh tier. However, I have to say that looking back, it's definitely one that sticks with you more than you expect. So I'm going to bump this up to solid. It's definitely a very literary take on science fiction. And it doesn't do anything particularly memorable or particularly groundbreaking, but at the same time, it does something very different and unique in terms of how it approaches this particular theme with this essay form of storytelling, where each page is this sort of interview from a member of the crew of this spaceship. And some of them are humans and some of them are humanoids, but you can't necessarily tell which essay is from which type of person. And it's definitely one of those that, even being really, really short, has a lot to unpack and a lot of layers to unpeel, and very unique and very original story in the way it's done, not necessarily in the terms of what it's trying to do, which has probably been done several times before, but in the way it's executed, it's still very original. So I think it would be unfair for me to put it down into meh. So this is one of those that I would have bumped up. And then I have On the Beach by Neville Shute. I rated this 5 out of 10, which would make meh tier, and I'm bumping this down to Time I Will Not Get Back. Because even thinking back now, it was just one of those that I wish I had not bothered with. This is a sort of post-apocalyptic book where Australia is the only part of the world that has survived a nuclear apocalypse, but the radiation is kind of slowly moving towards Australia, and there's this impending sense of doom. But the execution is pretty awful, in my opinion. The stories are very mundane, and this sense of doom that I think you want to feel is not quite done properly. So I'm afraid that was definitely one of my most disappointed reads for the year, I would say. Okay, moving on to fantasy, I have Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. This is part of Discworld. I rated this 3 stars at the time, so we're going to meh tier, and it hasn't changed. I still feel the same way, so it goes into meh tier. I just find Terry Pratchett's writing just a bit underwhelming. It's the second Discworld that I've tried, and both left me a bit... In theory, it seems like to have all the ingredients I'm supposed to enjoy. That kind of dry humor in a fantasy setting, what's there not to like? But for some reason, I can't really connect with the writing style. I didn't hate it, so it would never go into Time I Will Not Get Back tier. But still, it just feels very meh, so that's where it stays, I'm afraid. And then I have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and this very recently won the Women's Prize for Fiction. I read this back in June, I think. I rated this 4 stars, and that's where it stays, so it's solid. It's a really good book. I really loved especially the first half, trying to figure out what's happening. You're in this house where this guy called Piranesi lives, and there's only one other person in the house, but it's really weird as a setting, and you're trying to figure out what's happening because there are a few things that feel a bit incongruous as well. So I really liked it. At the same time, I have to say it has not become one of my new favorites, so it doesn't go higher than that. At the same time, it's one that I would really recommend. It's really literary side of fantasy as well, so I think for both people who enjoy more literary fiction but don't necessarily read fantasy, as well as for those people who just read mostly fantasy, I think this is a really great compromise, if that's the way to describe it, between the two genres, and it was really well executed, and I would definitely recommend it. And then I have the First Lord trilogy by Lord Grimdark Joe Abercrombie. I really enjoyed the trilogy. I rated it 8 out of 10. You can go watch my review for the whole trilogy as well. I pretty much stand by that rating. I didn't really distinguish between the 3 books in my previous review. It's a story that follows a number of pretty despicable characters, but pretty likable at the end of the day, nevertheless, which you can't help yourself but root for, despite their pretty evil actions. I have to say that book 1 and 2, I would still rate 4 stars, so I would put into solid tier. And book 3, I would put into donuts tier. I would say that's probably my favorite because I felt the ending sort of really defines the trilogy as a whole in the way it subverts a lot of the typical fantasy tropes. One of the key themes that Joe Abercrombie touches on again and again is war, and I really like the way he depicts war, not in that kind of glorified way that a lot of fantasy books tend to do, but in a more real, raw, and philosophical way in terms of how pointless it can also be. So definitely an amazing trilogy that I would strongly recommend to all fantasy fans. And then to conclude, I have a lonely non-fiction book. I have to say this year, I really haven't been in the mood for a lot of non-fiction. So 21 Lessons for the 21st Century is the only one I have. I rated 4 stars and it's still going to solid tier. I can't help but compare it to Sapiens to some extent, which is probably my favorite non-fiction book of all time, possibly. This is not as good as that, but it's still... Harari has a lot to say about the current trends when it comes to economics and politics and religion and the intersection of these. It's a really interesting read. If you've read and liked his previous books, I will still recommend this, particularly focusing on kind of our current trends and things that you can spot for now. Sort of differently from Sapiens, which was more focusing on our past, and Homo Deus, who focus more on things to come. Still a great read, and still a solid recommendation. So even after all this, it sounds like I haven't really changed my mind in terms of not having any 5 stars top tier reads for this year. Sometimes, I look back and I think, oh, this book really stuck with me and I'm going to bump it up to 5 stars. But for those 6 months, I'm afraid that still has not happened. So the dog's bollocks tier is still sadly empty. I hope you guys like this video. Please give me a thumbs up and I'll see you the next time.